Shalom. Salam. So, welcome to this second to the last session of our series on Zen and spiritual exercises. We are now looking at the third stage, that is called the stage of union, or if you look at another way of dividing the stages, I noted last time that there could be a way of dividing it into four, which includes the stage we looked at last time, the stage of sacrifice and of giving of one's life as the third stage. This could be the fourth then. But in any case, my original schema had the stage of dying to self and rising to the newness of life as integrated into this third stage of union. So what does that entail? Well, again, looking over the general format of the stages of the spiritual life, the stages of the life that comes from the center of our being, which allows us to see our connectedness with one another rather than living a life that is just based on the impulses and drives of the small self, the little ego. And so that is precisely the kind of path that we are seeking to live fully. So with that as our backdrop, we noted that spiritual traditions have mapped out three, or in another counting, four stages. We looked at the stage of purification, where the ego sees that it really is messing things up and needs to change its ways. It needs to really see things from a totally different perspective and perhaps have a change of life. And so what that entails is what we saw in the first stage, first week of the exercises. And so once now one has seen through all of those obstacles to leading a life that is centered, the spiritual life, one would now seek illumination. So what is the way? And that is what we looked at in the second stage, the stage of illumination, where we are given these glimpses of a way in which we can live in total freedom, with the wisdom of seeing things as they are without the obstruction of the little I, me, mine, the little selfish or self-oriented ego, in a way that is enlightened by what is, enlightened by the way things are. And the way things are can be described in many ways in words, but in a Buddhist understanding, the way things are is that we are all interconnected with one another, that we are inseparable from one another, that our fates, our destinies are truly intertwined. And so to see only my own little selfish orientation is really to distort the picture, because then I blot out or I block out my interconnectedness with everything else. And so this illumination is what enables us to see that connectedness with everything else and everyone else. So with that now, what is called for will be a true plunging into that life of interconnectedness, which means dying to the self. And that is what we saw in the third week of the exercises, where we see the image of Jesus, who died, although he was not doing anything wrong or harmful to people. He was just challenging the system that precisely was oppressing people, or that was just leading to different ways of classifying the first class and citizens and the others and so forth. So in challenging that kind of structure, both politically and religiously, he was considered a subversive. He, as we saw, was one who overturned conventional values and conventional views, and in doing so he was regarded as a threat to the established system. And in so doing, well, he was condemned to death. And so that act of really accepting that is his total gift of himself. And so it's so in Christian understanding, that gift of Jesus, of his own life, is his gift of him, his own self, so that that life that may ensue out of his death may be what everyone will be living. So it's the life of the risen one that comes out of the death to the self. So now we're looking at that stage where now the death to self has been experienced, or that has been undergone. And so now what is this newness of life that we are called to lead? So this is the fourth stage that, or third stage of union, or fourth stage that we are now looking at, and we're going to look at the implications of that. What does that entail? First of all, it's very important to note that we're not talking about life after biological death. About that kind of life, well, no one can give anything that is truly based on objective evidence. Well, someone might counter and say, but what about those who had near-death experiences? Didn't they go forth and have some such experiences and then came back to tell us about it? And so some of you may have had some readings of accounts of those who've had a near-death experience, and I've also been interested in that kind of writing, and I've checked out some. And of course there are varieties based on the cultural, religious, and linguistic and other kinds of background of the individuals. There's a movie right now that's also based on a near-death experience of a small child, a little boy. It's called Heaven is for Real. Yes, has anybody seen that? Well, it's a very, how would you put it? Well, heartwarming kind of movie about this family and this little boy. So anyway, the message there is that, well, there is something out there beyond death. But now, what? So the question then is, well, I mean, whether you take that and accept the premises of that story, or whether you take the other near-death experiences literally, well, that's something that, well, you can judge for yourself. But what we're most concerned about here is how all of that impacts or sheds light upon our life from here on in this on this side of death, so to speak. Now, when we say death in our conversations here, you notice I'm talking about two different levels here. The death, well, biological death is of course the most literal level of death, and that is a kind of fact that we all need to take account of when we are considering our life. How may I live my life to the full? How may I live my life in a meaningful way? How may I live my life in a way that when my actual biological death comes, I will be able to say that I have no regrets, I've lived to the full, and I am able to accept my death without any rancor or without any looking back. So that's a question that can propel us to really seek a life that is truly meaningful and truly full and worthwhile, the fact that we're going to die. And so really it's an important point for us to keep in mind as we continue in this earthly life with its, in its biological continuance. So now in that light, the task then is, what does this fact of my impending death have to do with how I live my life from now on? And so the second level of death that we're talking about is, as you've gathered by now, this death to the little self, the death to that which only thinks of itself and ignores others or belittles others or sees others only as instrumental to its own purposes and so on, in a way that others are not seen for their own autonomy, others are not seen for what they are, not seen in interconnectedness, but seen only in the way they can benefit me, or if they're not going to benefit me, then I either ignore them or I fight them and so on. So it's that kind of self-centered way of life that we are called to die to. So that's the second level, and that's the more important kind of level of death that we need to undergo in our life. So the spiritual life then is precisely a path that enables us to experience that death to the little self and thereby live the newness of life. So with that now, what I'd like to do for today's session is to look at three passages from the New Testament referring to the death of Jesus, and well, check out how Christians read them, those who are followers of this community that gave birth to these sacred scriptures, and how they read them, and then see how we, some of us may also be Christians in that regard, and some of us may be more or less open, questioning, or some of us may be doubtful of that whole Christian story. But whatever position we may have regarding Christian belief or doctrine, what we would like to do is look at these three passages and see how we may read them with an open eye, from the eye of the Spirit, the eye of one who is really seeking to live a spiritual life. And then after that, I'll look at a Zen koan, an aspect of Zen practice that is also helpful in shedding light on this question of a life that has undergone death, and then see how we can make some convergent threads there, and see some convergent threads, and see what it will do to give us some light in going deeper into our own spiritual path. So first of all, the passage about Jesus' resurrection are in the last segments of the four Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Now, first of all, the Gospel of Mark is known for having been added onto with a coda. The Gospel of Mark, in an earlier version, according to scripture scholars who looked at the whole text and analyzed its historical background, is said to have ended at a certain point where, well, Jesus just died, and all the disciples were afraid, so they were dispersed. There was no resurrection story in that first version of Mark. So that's something that, and then maybe some generations later, this Gospel of Mark had an addition which became the canonical version, which has been taken by Christians, which now includes the resurrection passages. So that's really something that calls our attention. What did Mark intend by that? So for him, this whole gospel is still a gospel of good news. And it's a gospel of good news about this Jesus who proclaimed the reign of God coming on earth. And so now, what is Mark's message in that regard? And so what I would like to look at first is a passage that might help us understand or get a hint as to what Mark may have intended in ending the gospel without any of the so-called resurrection accounts where Jesus was now manifested in glory and in fullness of light. Now, as we look at this passage that I cited on page 192 and 193, that's the passage, and that was the original ending, the 8th verse of Mark's 16th chapter. So the stories are not there, but what they hear is simply that they enter the tomb and they were told that you need not look for him here among the dead. So go to Galilee, there you will see him just as he told you. So it does not have any further accounts of the disciples actually seeing Jesus seeing him in his resplendent glory. But they were just told by these messengers, don't look for him among the dead, but go to Galilee, where he said he will be, as he told you. So that's a significant point I would like to note for us to consider. What does that mean? Go to Galilee. And so another passage that I cite here is from the Acts of the Apostles, which was also which is a continuation, or rather a second version, or a second part of what Luke wrote as a gospel, the good news of Jesus Christ. The Acts of the Apostles notes how the men and women who followed Jesus were looking up to heaven, forgetting their tasks of earth. And so they were told by the angel, people of Galilee, men and women of Galilee, why do you stand up looking toward heaven? You're looking for Jesus, but he has been taken up from to heaven, but he will come in the same way as we saw him go to heaven. Namely, what is that telling us? Don't just spend your time looking up to heaven, but look at what Jesus has taught you. He is in heaven, surely, but he is teaching you that you will also arrive at that in the way he did. And so there I take that as again pointing us to that passage from Mark that says, go back to Galilee. So what is Galilee? Scripture scholars again would have their different ways of interpreting this, but what I would like to offer is a reading that a good number would perhaps accept, that Galilee is the place where the followers of Jesus had lived their ordinary lives. They were, fishers' families and so on, and that's where they lived as human beings, doing their tasks, living from day to day, and engaging one another in their community life. And that's the hint that I take, where we will find the risen one. So now, again, we're looking at the exercises from a Zen light, and so already the Zen light can come and offer something to us here, namely, in our day-to-day life, in our ordinariness, what can we discover that really makes that ordinariness stand out as something so precious and so life-giving? So don't look for something that is just up there like a pie in the sky. Don't look for a reward after your death in the next life, but pay attention to the ordinariness of this life. I also noted that Latino and Latina theologians have come up with a term that precisely refers to that ordinariness of life, where the divine presence is manifested and where we are called to really pay attention and allow that divine presence to be fully manifest in our own lives. The term is lo cotidiano, the day-to-day life that we all lead. And in that lo cotidiano is where we're invited to open our eyes and find that divine presence, where we can live the fullness of life in the risen one. So that's the first hint I'd like to offer for us as we consider what that stage of union is, where we're no longer living based on our selfish ambition, based on our self-oriented thoughts and purposes, but we are living really in the light of that interconnectedness that we all are. So how can I live in a way that that interconnectedness is truly taken account of and is valued in my thoughts, words, and actions, and in my decisions, so that I make decisions not just for my own little welfare, but I make decisions that I am responsible for in a way that takes into account this whole world of interconnectedness that I, one subject among a multitude of subjects, am part of. So in that regard, if we really see one another in that light as interconnected subjects, co-responsible for one another. So in that light, how will that shine on our day-to-day lives? So that is the life of the risen one. That is a message being offered to us here. And so in that regard, I'd like to take another passage from another gospel. This is of Matthew. That is again taken by Christians in different ways, and to a great extent, from what I have heard in Christian discourse, it's usually taken as talking about the reward in heaven waiting for those who do good to the poor. This is the famous passage in Matthew 25 where Jesus is depicted as coming in all glory from the heavens and manifesting the fact that he is truly the divine presence among us, the Son of God, the child of God that came to manifest God's presence among us. And now he's here to judge all nations, to judge all beings as to whether they lived a righteous life or whether they deserve perdition. So let me just read that part that is right here, because it's an important passage to really look at with a clear eye. So this is from Matthew 25:31-40, which you will have also in your printed text. When the Son of Man comes in his glory, the Son of Man is a title from the book of Daniel, whereby the glorious one who will come and redeem and save the world is depicted, and so that's the term that Jesus is referred to. When the Son of Man comes in his glory and all the angels with him, and he will sit on the throne of his glory, all the nations will be gathered before him, and he will separate people from one another as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. And he will put the sheep at his right hand and the goats at the left. So there's a judgment here. Good sheep, bad goats. So sorry for the goats, but that was the image that they had then. Anyway, then the king will say to those at his right hand, "Come, you that are blessed of my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. I was naked, and you gave me clothing. I was sick, and you took care of me. I was in prison, and you visited me." Then the righteous ones will answer him, "Lord, when was it that we saw you hungry and gave you food, or thirsty and gave you something to drink? And when was it that we saw you a stranger and welcomed you, or naked and gave you clothing? And when was it that we saw you sick or in prison and visited you?" And the king will answer them, "Truly, I tell you, as you did it to one of these least of these who are members of my family, you did it to me." And it goes on about the goats who did not do that, and so the goats are dismissed to perdition in this passage. But our point of interest here is that question that the righteous ones asked. When did we do that? What did we do to deserve this glory that you're now inviting us to? Which means they were not conscious. They did not have the least idea that, well, okay, now I did it, and now therefore I deserve a reward in heaven. They were just asking, so what did we do to deserve this? And so then the main character, the Son of Man, points out, when you help your brother or sister who was in need, whether it was through hunger or thirst, or somebody needed some consolation, or somebody needed some companionship, or when you offered your heart, when you offered yourself to walk with someone who was around you or who was with you, I was there. I was that. Now, a very common Christian reading of this is, well, okay, let's help the poor because, Jesus is here, so we think of Jesus and then we look at the poor and then just really ignore the poor person as such and just think of Jesus. And so we look at a dualistic picture here. So the poor, those who are in need, those whom we're trying to console, really are not seen for what they are or for who they are, but we're seeing Jesus in them, and therefore we're just ignoring them and thereby insulting them, if that's the way we read this. And unfortunately, those who take this passage and say, okay, now let's go and help the poor, let's go and help the hungry, let's go and visit the people in hospitals, do that out of that kind of, maybe goodwill and so on. Or, again, they say, well, that's how we will get our reward in heaven, by doing these good things. So if you do that in a kind of an instrumental way, you're not doing justice to those that you are really serving. You're just using them for your own reward. You're just using them for your own sense of wanting to feel good. Just like so many volunteer activities that are being taught to our youngsters. Okay, let's do good. Let's do these good things because it's good for you. Whether they actually are, whether that's actually what they need or not. Well, maybe to some extent you're helping them out, the people who are truly in need of, whether it's food or other resources or your companionship by visiting in the hospital. But in doing so, put yourself in the place of the one being visited. I would feel a kind of an empty feeling if somebody came, not for me, but because they have some ulterior motive. They have Jesus in their minds and they want to visit me because they want to be in a good place with Jesus. So I would feel totally left out of the picture if I were going to be visited. So if that's the way that passage is read, then that seems to be not the kind of good news that the gospel is all about. So my question there is there another way of reading this? And so the hint that I'd like to just look at is really how can we visit someone and really visit that person and really make that person the important person that we're visiting, not for some ulterior motive of whether it's Jesus or whether it's some good thing we want to do. And so in that regard, the message here is, well, those who did them didn't have such ulterior motives at all. They were just doing the most natural thing. When somebody is hungry and you have some food, you just simply offer without thinking twice. Isn't that something that we all do most naturally? We don't have to be told that. Unless, well, our little self has really gotten so much the better of us that we're thinking, well, but I would need this food for my dinner tonight, so I don't want to share it with anybody else now. If we're that kind of selfish-oriented person, then of course we would not want to go out and help another. But somehow, the little child in us, that child that is still pure and is still able to respond to our neighbor without any such calculations or without any such selfish intentions, is the one that's being drawn forth here. And oh, here's an orange for you, here, have it. And so it's so natural for us to give what is there without calculating, without thinking twice, without trying to say, okay, I did that chap a good service, I hope I get something in return. Without all of that thought, the simplicity of just offering something for the fact of offering something. And in those precious moments, what this gospel is saying is, that's me. That's the divine presence among us. That's the divine manifested fully and truly. There is your reward. That's me. Nothing that you'll have to figure out as a reward in the afterlife. If you have that in mind, then again, that sullies the whole act itself. So the purity of the act is really just to be there in all simplicity and just to open our hearts to those around us. So that's the message I'd like to read in this, and I hope it's not just me, but I hope that it's something that we can all see and say, aha, maybe there's something to that. So that's an invitation to read in a way that is not calculating of a reward after doing the act or as a result of the act, but that the act itself is its own reward. The question that from the Zen perspective is also relevant for us here is, how can we live a life whereby each thought, each word, each act, each decision is itself fully what it is, and not done for the sake of something else. Just like what Thich Nhat Hanh says about washing dishes. How can we wash dishes in a way that it's not just done for the purpose of getting them clean so that we can get our work done, so that we can relax for tomorrow, so that we can do our things and so on, well, always with something looking forward. But just do something for the sake of itself. In so doing, maybe that's the key that we are looking for to truly have the fullness of life, in that each moment in our day-to-day life is in itself what it's for, and not for something else. And so in that regard, whatever it is, if we are fully there, and if we are truly able to acknowledge what is happening from the bottom of our heart as just that, then that's truly the fullness of life. And as to say it in religious language, that's where the divine presence is truly manifested. And so for those who don't like religious language, just simply saying each act is its own end, and that's just it. The fullness of life is there in whatever we do, if we are fully there. The risen one among us no longer live with that dualistic sense of means toward end, but a way in which our whole life is really an end in itself, in every component, and thereby to be able to celebrate with gratitude. Taking a deep breath, a third passage I'd like to offer for our consideration and reflection is the one where two disciples are walking, and they are talking about their big loss. They had just come from Jerusalem, and of course they were there to maybe directly witness, or maybe they were not actually there on Calvary, but they knew that this prophet that they had all looked up to as the one who would save Jerusalem was killed by the authorities, and so therefore their hopes have been dashed. So their hearts are heavy as they were walking away from Jerusalem toward a village called Emmaus, or Emmaus, based on the way people pronounce it. And so on the way they were joined by a stranger whom they did not fully recognize. And the stranger pointed out some things in their own tradition and in their own scriptures, trying to assure them, wait, don't just prejudge the issue now. Look again at what happened among you. And so as they were joined in conversation by this stranger, somehow they felt their hearts being warmed, that their hopes were being revived. Maybe there's something to that. Maybe not all is lost, or maybe we misread it. And so, well, they had not fully understood it when, according to the narrative, it's now time to take a rest. So they settle at an inn, or they go into an inn, and they're about to have dinner together. And at some point, the breaking of the bread, their eyes were opened. And so suddenly they rejoiced, because now they knew that their whole reading of that story, that they were just being that made their hearts heavy and so on, was totally just a misreading. And now that their eyes were opened, they went back and they told the disciples, he's not dead, he's alive among us, and we saw him at the breaking of the bread. So what does that mean, the breaking of the bread? We recognize the risen one at the breaking of the bread. Again, the reading I would like to suggest here is, well, this breaking of the bread is the term of a ritual that the followers of Jesus had come to do among themselves in commemoration of Jesus, who had been taken away from them by the authorities and was killed. And so, as the scriptures say, before he was taken up to be led to death, Jesus gathered his disciples and he had dinner with them. And he took bread, and gave thanks, and he broke the bread and gave it to his disciples and said, "This is my body given up for you. Take and eat." So they had that meal where Jesus had told them, "This is my body given up for you." And so, again, same thing with the cup. He took a cup of wine and offered it to them and said, "This is my blood, which will be shed for you and for all, for the many. Do this in memory of me." They didn't fully understand what he meant at that time, but after he was taken away and after he had died, they remembered him, or they had that ritual again, and so that's what they were now doing in commemoration of their beloved Jesus who had been taken away from them. And these two disciples had experienced that. Their eyes were opened at the breaking of the bread. So this breaking of the bread is now a sacred ritual that is a sign of the community taking the same bread. And so you can take that as that ritual act whereby their eyes were opened and they realized Jesus is here with us as long as we do this together. But another way of looking at it is, well, those who don't take to that ritual, those who are not within the Christian community, can we read that in a way that also has any reference to those in the wider circles? Well, breaking of the bread, as I hear in the Arab world, Middle Eastern world, well, refers to the meal together, and how a meal really is a very, very sacred occasion whereby the intimate circle of friends, family, of loved ones get together, and in breaking bread together they really affirm their oneness and they affirm their sense of bonding together in that shared meal. And so in realizing that bonding, then of course there is that nourishment to live that interconnection with one another. So this simple act of breaking bread together is a key point I'd like to just highlight here as the key for us. We break bread every time. Well, it doesn't have to be bread, it could be fruit, or it could be just taking tea together or taking coffee together. In those simple acts of conviviality among human beings, isn't there a sacred presence that waits to be acknowledged? That can be truly nourishing and liberating for us. And so we tend to miss them because we just tend to think them as casual occasions where we just relax and get together and then chat a little bit and then go on. But to those with eyes, maybe what happened to the two disciples on the way to Emmaus may also happen to us, that our eyes may be opened with the breaking of the bread or with the sharing of the cup. So what does that mean in our day-to-day life? So that's the kind of reading that I'd like to suggest might be possible with these readings of the resurrection narratives, namely not some flashy figure coming up saying, "Look, I'm risen," in a very, very physical way, but as a spiritual event that gradually spread through those who knew Jesus when he was alive and who realized, yeah, that's what he's telling us. He's alive right here and now among us. In our ordinariness, when we break bread together or when we help one another, when we go out and just open our hearts to one another, that's Jesus right in the midst of us. And that's the divine presence right in our midst. What more can we want? So that's what gave them strength to really proclaim the good news of Jesus to the ends of the earth. That it's alive in all of us, as long as we really focus our eyes on what's important. So those are the three passages I wanted to lift up for a Zen reading. That may not be totally alien to what Christians can also understand from within. So here is one way in which perhaps Christians and those outside of a Christian circle alike may have some way of convergence in understanding the significance of these events, these narratives, in a way that those of us who are seeking to live a life in the Spirit may be able to recognize one another. This is what I'm reminded of when people from different faith traditions, whether it be Hindu, Buddhist, Jewish, Christian, Muslim, Sikh, Native American, and so on. I've been to some of these interreligious gatherings, and people come with their different doctrinal or ritualistic or ethical imperatives and so on, and they are persons who try to represent their own traditions without watering them down. And so if you look at those different expressions, they're all different. There's no way of just saying, let's blend them into one common denominator. There may not be a possible so-called common denominator. But yet when these persons who live a spiritual life from within their own traditions are in the presence of one another, somehow there's a sense of being able to understand one another beyond the language, beyond the differences in doctrine and ritual and so on. It's not so much a common denominator, but perhaps a shared ground of sacredness that is that everyone is aware of, in and through the differences of the doctrinal and ritualistic and other expressions that the various representative religious traditions bring, or even those who have no explicit religious tradition. If they are living sincerely according to their conscience and as truly righteous human beings, somehow there is also that connection that spiritual persons can find among such persons. So in that regard, how can we commune with one another at that level and not get lost in the differences in philosophical or theological or religious terminology that we use to express that which is most precious to us? So that's one task that each of us seeking to live that kind of life in the Spirit will be continuing to encounter from here on for the long haul. So now, next session, which will be the last session, I'll try to offer a summary picture of what a person who has gone through these stages may look like, in a way that we may also see a model that we might try to see as life-giving for us, and so see how we might be able to learn from that kind of picture that Zen and the spiritual exercises of Ignatius present in a converging way that may be of reference to our own spiritual life. Now finally, from a Zen perspective, there is a koan in the Zen tradition that refers to how to live a life beyond death. Beyond death, not meaning, or rather on one level you might tend to think that it's talking about that life that is after our biological death, and that's certainly one way of reading it if you read it literally. But the Zen koan as such, a koan is a public case. It's said in words that are publicly open, understandable to anyone, but it offers a glimpse of that world of Zen that can only be open to one who has taken on a path of practice whereby that whole dimension can be open. And this a koan that talks about 3 barriers presented by this Zen master Tosotsu. The first barrier is about seeking our true nature. We go about this life with a lot of delusions. We go about with a lot of sidetrackings and a lot of obstacles in the path of true freedom, in the path of true wisdom and compassion. So as we wade through these obstacles, which are depicted as tall grasses and fields, so as we wade through these tall grasses and fields, seeking our true nature, where is that true nature that you're looking for? Right there, as you go about and look for that. So that's the first barrier. Now, if you have really realized that true nature, once you've found it, and you're one with it, you will now be freed from the cycle of birth and death. Now, if you have really freed yourself from the cycle of birth and death, how will you accomplish that? Right there when you're truly about to die, at that point of your biological death. Fast forward to that point, whether it be when you're dying at a ripe old age, or whether you die in a car accident, or by a bullet wound, or by a stroke, or slipping in your shower and hitting your head and then dying out of that, concussion, whatever those set of circumstances may be. At that point, when you're about to die, how will you free yourself from this cycle of birth and death? That's the second barrier. And so now the third barrier is what we're concerned with. Okay, you're dead. You've either been cremated or buried, and it's now sometime since that has occurred. So your physical elements have now been dispersed all over. Where are you going? That's the third barrier that Tosotsu asks. And this "where are you going" is an invitation to look at that realm that is beyond linear time, beyond past, present, and future, and to really arrive at our true home in this place that we can only call the eternal now. Live in that eternal now and answer that question, where are you going? So this is the third barrier of Tosotsu. And so the hint that I'd like to offer here is, first of all, on two levels. The first level is the answer by my teacher's teacher, which I also write down here. When you have been buried, or after you've been buried, and your bones have disintegrated, your flesh is now one with the elements, where are you going? And Yasutani Hakun Roshi's answer was, I will go where my karma leads me. Well, taking the Buddhist worldview, we go wherever we deserve to go based on what we've done. If we did some good things, we might go at a place that is truly advantageous, or truly beneficial, or truly good and pleasurable for us. If we did harmful things, then we may go to a place where we will have to work out the consequences of those evil things or harmful things we did. And so he had in mind the 10 realms of the Buddhist cosmology, and at the bottom realm is the place for the hell dwellers, those who are living totally self-centered lives that are totally close to everybody else. Then there's the realm of the hungry ghosts, then there's the realm of the fighting spirits, and there's the realm of the animals who live by their instincts, and then the fifth realm is the realm of the human being, and above that is the realm of the devas, or the heavenly beings with their very long lives and very suprahuman powers and so on. And above that are the hearers of the way, the bodhisattvas and the buddhas. Anyway, he says, if I did things that are worthy of my being sent to hell, then my answer to that is I'll go to hell. Or if I have practiced in a way that I've seen my true nature, then I'll be in the Buddha world. And so on, whatever it is. So he's not giving any definitive answer except I'll go where my karma leads me. And what that indicates for me is that he's at peace with himself. He's responsible for what he has done. Yes, he's responsible for what he has, for the life that he has lived, and is totally at peace with its consequences. So that's the invitation that this koan can offer to us. Are we able to live our life in a way that we are truly grounded and that we can truly accept the consequences of our actions? Or are there still some things that we feel we need to make up for? And if so, then the only thing to do is do that so that we can come to that peace of mind. After you're dead and buried and all of that, where are you going? Can we answer that with a peace of mind that whether we're going to heaven or hell or whatever our afterlife view may be, we're at peace with that? That's the point of the koan. And so that's the first point. The second point then, which is a deeper point that I'd like to invite us to look at, is again what I hinted at earlier. Can we take this koan as an invitation to go beyond the linear time frame that we think our lives to be governed by, namely the past, in a very fleeting and always moving present towards an unreachable future. We're looking at our lives from that linear perspective. But if we cut through that and just take what this practice of Zen or this practice of meditation, even in a generic way, offers to us, it's simply living the present moment. Can we arrive at this present moment and live there in all fullness without any grasping for something outside of it, without any hankering for the past, but truly live the present moment? And if we're living in that present moment, the question, where are you going, will be answered in a most spontaneous way. So that's the koan, the heart of the koan. So I won't tell you how it's answered in the one-on-one interview, because that's also a forum that will be relevant when you get there. But it's just a hint for us how to live the life of the awakened, how to live the risen life, taking from Christian scriptures, as Ignatius invites us to in the exercises, and taking from Zen perspectives. And somehow there's a convergence that I see here, living a life in the fullness of the present moment. So I'd like to end with this and then look at our overall picture in our last session on June 15. Thank you.
Thank you.
Questions, comments, general observations? And since this is at least a small group enough for us to have exchanges, we'll just continue in this way, and then we'll continue munching and then kind of close off the session. Any observations or questions? Or
There was in one of our session we had a Eucharist, and one of the readings in the Eucharist, I can't remember where it came from, but it seemed like it was Moses that made a comment to the Jews about, where are you looking for salvation? It's not in the stars or in the heavens, but it's right here among us.
Moses?
Was it Moses?
I don't recall such a passage with Moses coming up, unless it was a reading from Hebrew scriptures, which again I don't recall.
I'll have to think about it a little bit, maybe try to find some notes.
Well, there is a passage from the so-called event of the Transfiguration, where Jesus takes Peter, James, and John, and they go up to this mountain, and Jesus is transfigured before them. And so Peter says, "Oh, this is a divine presence. Let's build 3 tents here, 3 tabernacles, 3 commemorations of the holy, in honor of Moses, in honor of Elijah, and now of Jesus." And so that's at least the closest I can remember of Moses appearing in a passage like that. But it's not Moses himself who says anything.
Okay.
Anyway,
Well, the passages was what struck me more than it being Moses.
Moses saying, "Don't look."
It was someone who was chiding some of the followers in that way by saying, you know, where are you looking for this? It's not in the stars. It's not in.
Okay.
It's not in the heavens. Look right here.
Okay.
And it's someone.
Again, yeah. I mean, in Zen, well, there is the two kinds of practice that are most prescribed are the simple practice of just sitting, where we're just invited to live fully each here and now and just sit and let that sit be its own reward, not for the sake of getting enlightenment and so on. And that's really the most profound way of sitting in Zen. And then there's the kind of process that's given to those who have a very strong discursive mind, who need to keep figuring out things, to put that mind to a stop with a koan. And the koan is supposed to really block that discursive mind from going any further. So it's like a wedge that is thrown at someone who's trying to figure out things by unraveling this or that, and so you put a block there, and so you're immovable. And in realizing that you can't move, then something is opened up, rather than trying to struggle further and so on. So that's the koan. So in that regard, the koan is simply a block to that attempt at looking further or trying to figure out. So, for example, this koan mu. A monk asked Joshu, does a dog have Buddha nature or not? And if you look at Buddhist tradition, Mahayana tradition says that all beings are endowed with Buddha nature. So this monk was simply raising a very logical question. Where it comes from, well, you can only guess. Whether you couldn't believe that such a four-legged creature could have a Buddha nature like other beings could, and so on. Does a dog also have Buddha nature? Where's Pepe, by the way? He has the answer to that. Oh, okay. Anyway, and Joshu's answer to that question is mu. And the practitioner then is invited to just take that mu as the stopper for one's speculation. You're not supposed to look for what's behind mu, not to look for a meaning of mu, but simply to let that be your invitation to be right here, right now, and live the present moment, so that that present moment can open up to the whole universe. So that's the way. But many people who are given that koan have to work around it for some time, maybe a few years even, before they can really come to that place where their mind stops and just takes that mu for the key and opens and lets it be the gateway to that world that is truly inclusive of everything. So again, it's like that kind of stopgap to our thinking. So look right here, it's right there already, as you say, whoa, it's right there, see? But then people try to use their mind to think, well, where is it? What's the connection? And so again, our mind is always moving, and that therefore we're kind of missing it. It's like, well, again, sorry for the dog, but like a dog trying to catch its own tail by going around and around trying to catch it, it'll never get it, if that's the way our mind works. So once the dog stops and realizes, hey, you can even wag it. I'm one with that tail, right? From the start, why do I have to get it in my mouth? And so there, you're at peace. So it's a way of finding peace with yourself, realizing that you're all interconnected right from the start. So that's how that Zen koan works. Any other comments, questions? This thing, well, the main thing I wanted to convey here is that this is not about a life-seeking reward in an afterlife. The resurrection, the risen life, is not something about after our biological death, then we'll get whatever we want. Because that will truncate our lives into something that is just a means towards an end that is still to come, and therefore we're not doing justice to this life that we have it right now. as it is given to us. So that's the invitation of this kind of spiritual practice, to really value each moment in this life as the place where the sacred is manifested, and value each one that we meet in that life, in this life, precisely as our gateway to that sacredness. Okay.
Like, I believe in life before death.
That's a good point. Yeah. Thank you. Yes.
I read that.
That's a good one. That's a good expression. Yeah, that could be a good book. Life before death. I also wanted to refer to this account by Anita Murjani that I had mentioned before about her own near-death experience. Well, of course, she comes back to live, and so she died of cancer, put it that way. But, well, with all the biological signs of death, still, after a few hours, she came back, and then after about, well, so she was again resuscitated, and then after about 5 weeks of a recovery process, the cancer disappeared, so she became a fully healthy and normal human being again after that process. And so she has these recollections of what she went through during that time when, for all practical purposes and for all of those who knew her, she was just conked out and gone to the other world. And she describes it in a way that really affirms the kinds of things that we can learn about from our own Zen practice. That it's really a world of truly of unconditional love that we're all affirmed by. So next time I'll cite from that as part of the summary that I'd like to offer. And it really affirms the same things that Ignatius is referring us to, namely, well, this final chapter of his exercises is called the Contemplation on Divine Love, which is really just an invitation to sit there and let yourself be suffused with that love that is being given freely and in a way that is not because we merited it, but it's just a pure gift, and it's to each and every one of us in our own way, to our heart's content. So if we can only realize that, then really no more need to scramble around for anything, for my own self-recognition, for my own fame, for my own benefit and so on, because everything is already there, given to us. So how can we arrive at that total openness whereby that's always something we can have access to? That's what this practice of stillness can open our hearts to. So if we had a small circle of just sharing, one question would be, well, just a practical note. Hi, Pepe. No, answer me. Does the dog have Buddha nature?
He's not saying.
You're like a Zen master, huh? Well, what are your, well, I mean, we all had different stages of our own spiritual development, I can gather, but what about afterlife? How did your own ideas about the afterlife or after death develop, and where are you now in that regard? Anything, well, it's a kind of maybe a heart-to-heart sharing of where we are. I mean, we all come from different backgrounds, and some of us may be still in a sense able to call ourselves religious and spiritual, or some spiritual but not religious and so on, or whatever background that may be. Just a kind of a random sampling of our views on the after death or afterlife, if there's any, if any, and so on. Anything anyone could contribute in that regard. How do you regard the after death realm or afterlife?
I always presumed that afterlife is probably going to be pretty much like before life was. I just don't remember back that far. maybe it's because of my age, but we all had a non-existence from here before our births back to wherever. And it seems to be a very natural process that all of that existence ended up like this. And so I just kind of feel that things are going to work out in a similar way, that it's going to be okay. Whatever it is, I'll be going
Back to that.
back to whatever I was before I became whatever I am now.
Okay, okay.
So it doesn't really bother me because I don't have any painful memories of being before my birth of any, anything upsetting or strange or, I mean,
Okay.
it seemed like, well, that got me here, and so there's
That
probably,
get me out of here also.
yeah,
That's the
the
way out.
ride, yeah.
I see. Thank you. Any other personal takes? Helen?
Yeah, it's not about the afterlife, but you were talking about the breaking of the bread with them, and I cannot help but recall in, I don't know, when Florence and I went to the Sweat Lodge. Has anybody gone to the Sweat Lodge?
Native American?
A Sweat Lodge in Oklahoma.
Tell us what it involves.
Oh, it's very interesting. Of course, one of the things that I did not like is that they always have rules about women, Like for women, you can't wear something like this. You have your period, you can't go. You can't wear shorts. So you have to be almost like in a state of purity. Okay?
Yeah,
Then
sure.
I look at the men, and they're all half naked. What is this?
Unfair.
Unfair, yeah, that was the first reaction.
Did you gosh show?
I said, should I go in or not? But anyway, you go inside the, what is it, like the wigwam, the tepi, something, and they keep burning this stone.
So what are you wearing? You're wearing
you have to
a robe?
you have to wear something long and something that's covering this, no plunging neckline. You gotta be really covered. But men can go half naked. And inside the tent, the men are all together. Then on the other side, the women are all together. And so, okay. And what they do is they keep, adding, I don't know how they make it really so hot. And of course they had the chants. But what came to mind during that time was also like, when you partake of communion during the Mass, or when you're drinking together. In that particular moment then, what transpired was, it was the communion of the sweating together.
the sweat.
The sweat. Yes, it's the sweat. It's it's
break sweat together.
Yeah, you sweat together. And somehow, of course, it's still a communal activity which connected all of us to whatever was happening there. So, and it happened on Good Friday.
Oh, you went on a
I'm
Good
a
Friday.
Catholic and I'm supposed to be in church, and my sister was very upset because I was in a sweat lodge on Good Friday. But I just wanted to experience what the Indians, were doing, and I think it was a very powerful experience for Florence and myself, just to participate, just bearing the heat
Oh.
together. I mean, I think it's more of the together.
I see.
doing
Okay,
things
I see.
together,
Yeah.
not
Oh.
necessarily how
Going
much you
through.
can endure, because other people would step out of the tent when it was too hot, too hot. But just the communion of the sweating
Yeah. Well,
together, connectedness.
battle scarred together and so on. Yes.
Yeah.
Going through a
So
rough
once you
experience
went
together.
through that, was there any other part of the ritual, or you just go through that and then?
Yeah, you go through that, and if you cannot endure the heat, then you have to step out. Or
And then what else? Then what else? Do they have some kind of closing ceremony or
That's what I was
whatever?
Yeah, the leader of the group would pray. He had some Indian prayers to put a closure to the ceremony. And then after that, you all go together and listen to the, I don't know how they call the person, master. And again, there would be some sharing.
And what do you recall of the sharing? What did people experience?
I was experiencing more the heat.
Of
So I
course.
could not recall any of the sharing. But really, when you're sweating, it's almost like that hot yoga that they say, and it's a very powerful experience. I
Oh,
think.
really?
I just wanted to be involved in that Indian spirituality.
So this bonding is what you were referring
Yeah,
to?
the
Having
doing
been together.
things together. So I mean,
Yeah.
like what we're doing now. We're doing this together.
So it's like different traditions have their
Yeah,
different
yeah,
way
they
of
have
bonding.
a way of
Same thing with the
communing.
breaking bread,
Yeah,
the
right,
sweating
right.
together.
The sweating together. Exactly.
Different ritual.
And on a different note about life after death, the more I see myself having unfinished business, I always think about somebody will have to continue what I left unfinished. I think. Somebody, whoever the next Helen will be. But the realization of also, this is as good as it gets.
Mm-hmm.
That's it.
So, the unfinished business, you're leaving it to somebody else to finish?
I don't know, because I mean, who in the world would finish everything in this life? Somehow we still have unfinished business. Even if you probably will create a list and you have a to-do list, and then you die, and I'm sure you must have done, you must have an unfinished business. But it's good.
All things come together unto good. All will be well. Who was that? Julian of Norwich. All will be well. All manner of things will be well. Well, that was the message that I keep getting from these near-death experiences. It's all right. Don't worry. It's gonna be good. So don't worry about it, really.
After you recommended that book to me and I read it, I recommended it to one of my hospice patients.
Oh, okay.
Which book?
Which book?
Dying to be me
Dying
is
to
the
Be Me.
title by Anita Murjani.
It's the book he was talking about with the near-death experiences in it.
So what did your...
She has metastatic breast cancer,
oh.
and she is a Mormon.
Mm.
And she read it and just knocked her for a loop. She loved it
Oh, okay.
and just thought it was just really. She took a lot of strength from it,
Oh, okay.
and she recommended it to. Although she has metastatic breast cancer and she's in a hospice program, she doesn't live her life like that.
Oh.
She's busy. She goes out and she belongs to social clubs and does all of this. She's like she's too busy to have cancer type of a person. Just really and well I've got a tea meeting and a book club and so she's been sharing this book with a lot of her friends.
Okay, I see.
And everybody loves it and has found a lot of nourishment from it.
Yeah, wow, okay. Well, indeed, it is a very powerful book, so I'd like to recommend it to everyone else also. Dying to be Me is the title.
Well, I think we have a chance to live on in what we do and how people remember us. Like my great Aunt Nellie lives on with my memories of her and what she did, and my grandmother lives on with what she did for me and all the grandkids. So we have the opportunity
Yeah.
to live on.
That's how also the Jewish community looks. I mean, they may have different views of the afterlife, but from what I hear, it's really letting the forebears continue what was left off, or to live on in your progeny is what many of them hope for. Not a sense of personal immortality or anything like that, but really just that your life is meaningful in what you bequeath to the succeeding generations.
And I do have trouble, like when we went to your grandmother's funeral, and Uncle Bob was talking about, well, it's going to be great. Everybody's going to get together, when we go to heaven, and like it's going to be some big party.
Yeah,
And
he has a very
you know.
he has a very traditional view.
yeah, we're like, okay, is this going to be in a house? Yeah.
Sounds great.
Sounds like a big party. Yeah, we're gonna all see Gran again
Like
and
a family reunion.
reunion. Yeah, very literal heaven.
Yeah, well, we don't want to disenfranchise them of that, but
Right,
somehow
right.
to respect that.
Sure,
and,
exactly.
But those of us who cannot just take that as such,
Yeah,
well,
that's good.
how do we then express ourselves in a way that can also make sense?
Mm-hmm.
First of all to ourselves, and then those to others, so on.
Well, those of us that feel that using different languages, you know, that we have a soul, or we have a spirit, or we share an essential nature, or, you know, that there is something beyond us, beyond this body of water and calcium and iron and all the elements, that there's more there, that many faiths believe that that part of us is eternal and will be shared and is shared, not only in this life through moments like you described, but also when this body falls away and this spirit moves on, whatever language you want to use. There are many faith traditions that share that, and what he's saying may be just the very same thing in the language of his faith, you know, maybe a very fundamental, simple way of saying that there is something there to us that we share, and that after death perhaps we share that with each other in some way. So that may be another level of what
Right. No, you're
he's saying.
you're absolutely correct that you know, as humans, sometimes the only way we can explain the unexplainable is to create sort of a story or an image based on what we
Correct,
know.
yeah.
Wishful thinking.
Yeah.
Well, and based on what we do know.
The
Yeah.
familiar.
Yeah, and that's
Based
what.
on
Very
what
well
we do
said.
know, exactly.
Yeah, the word myth is really something that refers to that. It's putting into language that which basically cannot be expressed
Right.
in the kind of language that we humans use. So what it does is give us a picture or a story, precisely. And it's not that the myth is false, but it's just that it's pointing to something, to a dimension beyond itself, and so we don't need to take it literally. Though some people do take it literally, like, well, but those who don't doesn't need to. Those who don't take it literally don't need to debunk the myth altogether
Right.
and say that
Okay.
the myth is false. No, the myth is true in the way you take it, as pointing to something, but not in a literal way.
It's poetry.
Right, also, that's another way of putting it. Like, my son Florian was in a class in middle school, and his teacher said, well, they had this thing about Greek mythology and so on, and then the teacher mentioned in passing, oh yeah, the Bible, that's also a book full of myths. So from then on, he took that to heart because, well, he liked the teacher, and what she was doing in class was something that he really liked. And so, yeah, well, the Bible is a myth. So he took it in the wrong way, that it's all false, and so he says, well, I'm an atheist. From that time on, he says, you know, I don't believe in that stuff anymore. But anyway, but that's really misconstruing what a myth is for. Like the story of Adam and Eve, many Christians seem to have taken that literally, that there was this man, and there was this woman, and there was this serpent, and then there was this tree, there was a, whether it was an apple or not, but anyway, and so this whole question of evolution versus the Bible is still a raging one among many Christian circles, and really it's an anachronistic way of reading the Bible. It's not a literal historical account, but it's a human story about an event that led to a fall from grace, and so what is it telling us? And it can be read in a way that precisely points to events in our human relationships, in our human heart, that don't have to be taken in a very literal and historical way. And so unfortunately, it's that kind of misreading that makes people at odds with one another. Yeah,
I have a question. I often wonder what is the afterlife for people who have never repented. like somebody who's,
Yeah.
probably electrocuted,
Yeah.
or a rapist, or somebody who just, dies and
Mhm.
doesn't have any guilt.
Yeah, really.
I
I
often
find it hard to
wonder,
imagine.
what's the afterlife for them.
Yeah, I can't imagine.
Well, I
I
hope
have a
they,
piece of paper, please, thank you.
I hope they find peace, even though they haven't been able to unravel their own pain. I feel that peace will be granted to them.
But who knows, in their internal realm, when they're there,
At the moment
face
of
to face
death,
with themselves,
yeah.
there may be that chance that is not perceptible to anyone outside of them, that they're brought face to face with the horrors of what they may have done and so on. Who knows? Who, well, as to quote a famous personage of the moment, who am I to judge?
Yeah.
And so on.
But Houston Smith has another take on that.
Oh,
said
what did
that
he
the
say?
like close to the moment of death,
Mhm.
what happens is if, let's say, at age 5 you were raised a Catholic, or whatever religion you were raised at age
Mhm.
5, at a certain
Mhm.
age in your life, everything just goes back at that moment.
Mm.
And probably said that might be your saving factor. Who knows?
Mhm. Well, that reminds me of two separate stories. While I was in Japan, there was a family who lived just, well, we were up in a nice little hill where the Jesuit school was, language school where I was studying Japanese at. And walking down the hill from our Jesuit house, there was a house of a family whose high school son, a senior, died in an accident. And that son apparently had been very, very close to the church. He was someone who got close to one of the priests who would often go and take walks in the afternoon and so on. So that son was baptized anyway, and then the whole family in time, within a year or so after the son died, asked for baptism, and then they became Catholic, including the grandmother, who was then about 70, and then the mother, father, and then the older brother of the boy who died. So the whole family became Catholic, and they were attending Mass at our place regularly. So anyway, when the grandmother had a stroke about several years later, now she lost her short-term memory, and what she could be heard reciting was Namu Amida Butsu, this chant of Pure Land Buddhism that she was raised in. So before that, well, for several years after having been Catholic, they recited the Rosary, they recited the prayers of Catholic devotions and so on. But when her present memory, when her short-term memory was gone, that pristine sense of religiosity came back, and it was in the form of Namu Amida, the Buddhist expression of devotion to the Buddha Amida, who was believed to be someone waiting to take one across across to the Pure Land at death. Now another story is from a Buddhist nun, an American in Pennsylvania, who told me that she was ministering to an elderly lady who was a very devoted Zen practitioner and became Buddhist. And then again, she was near her death throes, and what happened was then what she started reciting was the Rosary from her own mind that was just in that state of near unconsciousness, but her religious devotion came back to her Catholic upbringing. So anyway, so across those images comes a deeper sense of belonging to a community, and that connects you with the sacred.
Yes, I always think of death as a transition, and